I'm very grateful to you for introducing me and explaining that I'm a social anthropologist, and I'm not an economist, I'm not a finance person, so I feel in many ways that I'm not really the best person to be sitting up here. I think my sole qualification for being here is that I am a European. And actually, I interjected in the course of your introduction to say, oh, I'm English. And I really do feel very English, but I'm, I think, one of the relatively few people in England who would also say, I'm a European. Constructing a European identity is a process that I think hasn't gone nearly as far as it needs to. Anyway, I think that what I would like to contribute to this discussion, initially anyway, really follows from those introductory remarks about the EU. Because my first reaction on seeing the title of this discussion was actually to say, what crisis? You know, there's a great deal of hype about a crisis in Europe, but there are plenty of signals which point the other way. You know, a crisis in Europe, but isn't it interesting that the major European stock markets have been, you know, climbing rapidly over the first few months of this year? Okay, the FTSE, the Financial Times Stock Exchange Index, hasn't sort of hit a new ceiling in the way that the Dow did last week, but it's, you know, as somebody who has a pension in the UK, you know, I do kind of care about what's happening in the stock market, and the London stock market is looking much healthier today than it has at any time since January 2008. So, you know, something's going on that has given a real kind of upward push to stock markets in Europe. And also following from your remarks there about the strengths of Europe, the last time I saw any figures on this, I believe that 27%, am I right? 27% of reserves across the world are held in euros, and this is, you know, supposed to be a currency in crisis. The exchange rate of the euro against the dollar, much stronger than at the time the euro was formed. So, you know, it seems to me there are plenty of indicators of the strengths of the European economy. I also think that Europe has actually put in place the European Union. Oh, actually, I should qualify that to say the countries which are part of the Eurozone in particular, but in the context, the framework of the European Union, have put in place, I think, the architecture for stability. It's clear that the European Central Bank has been ready to intervene and has built up the means through the European Stability Mechanism of intervening to ensure that the kinds of developments that took place in the recent past won't recur. The framework for a banking union is in place, and, you know, the Eurozone hasn't broken up. And I think that the indications are now very clear that it's not going to break up because of, as I said, the architecture, regulation and so on being in place to cope with crisis better than was the case in the recent past. And I think that there is no doubt about the commitments of Europe's leaders. I think the leadership in Europe has not been great over the last 2 or 3 years, but I think there's no doubt of the commitments of European leaders to the Eurozone and to the European Union. Of course, there is an ongoing recession, a very serious recession, especially in the southern European countries, and actually in many ways in the UK as well. I feel particularly about the recession in Portugal because I have a young colleague at Simon Fraser University who is currently the Minister for the Economy in Portugal. He's got bags of chutzpah and he really needs it in order to hold that job down, as he has done now for getting on for 2 years. So there is unquestionably, there's a big crisis, especially in the southern European countries, and I think perhaps at the core of the problems of those economies now is a credit crunch. That it's extremely difficult, especially for the small businesses that generate most employment, to raise finance for their operations, except at very high cost. But I think that I don't know whether you would agree with me or not, but what I think I sense happening across Europe is a recognition that there's this difficult balancing act of dealing with deficits, but it's no good being so stringent as to cut off any prospects for growth. And in relation to my own country, in relation to the United Kingdom, I find it very interesting that now we have The Economist, the Financial Times, saying to the Finance Minister, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, Mr. Osborne, it's good on you for pursuing the course of sort of fiscal rectitude, but you've really got to do something about growth, about rekindling growth. And as some of you may have seen, The Economist just last week carried some advice to Mr. Osborne about how that might be done. So I think that's certainly one straw in the wind, but I see similar straws elsewhere in Europe. So I think I'd say at the beginning of this discussion, let's not get sort of too carried away with the notion of crisis, that the whole thing's going to sort of come tumbling down like a sort of house of cards. Just to sort of come on to Europe in relation to Asia, perhaps the last point that I should have made in relation to the EU is just to point out, or to remind us all, that one of the big priorities that President Obama has established for his new administration is to conclude a trade agreement with the European Union. Mr. Obama certainly hasn't given up on Europe. And if those negotiations reach a conclusion, in the reasonably short term, then the implications, it seems to me, for European growth, for American growth, and then for Asian economies are really potentially, I think, quite positive. Just lastly, maybe a word on the British position. I said at the beginning of my remarks that I do actually think of myself as a European, and I have always personally been a strong supporter of the United Kingdom taking the fullest possible, participating to the fullest possible extent in the European project. And to me, it is a matter of great regret that the backwoodsmen in the ruling, partly ruling Conservative Party are so antipathetic to Europe and have really, I think, tied the Prime Minister's hand in such a way as to commit, have led him recently to commit to renegotiating Britain's position in Europe and then to hold a referendum on that renegotiated position. I think this is going to create uncertainty, which is certainly not in the interests of the United Kingdom, and I don't think it's in the interests of Europe either. I think that this was part, however, of the background to David Cameron's recent visit to India, with a whole sort of battery of business people, because of course part of the argument which is being put by those whom I described as the backwoodsmen in the Conservative Party is that there is an alternative sort of future for the UK through its relationships with the Commonwealth countries, through relationships outside Europe. And in that context, India is extremely important. Those in my country who think that, need to look a little bit more closely at the figures. I mean, I think British trade with Rhine-Westphalen is actually considerably more important than British trade with India.